irrelevant aside from the main story. It's not just a matter of sticking the word white in before saying Jews or inserting the word Christian in before African Americans. Taking that issue seriously meant rethinking everything I had been saying. Not that my conclusions changed exactly. It was recognizing that despite many people's insistence that I'm not white, I'm Jewish, European Jews did in fact benefit from white skin privilege. And refusing to recognize that made us and me complicit in many ways our society is set up to favor white people over Black. In other words, my thinking had been too narrow and too parochial and missed some important insights about challenges to coalition building. Well, why does it matter? Well, of course it matters to Jews of color to be finally recognized and embraced. Scholars of American Judaism have been portraying a white-centered story of American Jews rather than what it really is, a multicultural, thickly textured one. And understanding how deeply we white Jews had been entwined with American systems of white supremacy also helps us see where white Jews like me and our organizations have gone wrong in our coalition building work. Most of us reject overt racism and know that we have to be anti-racist politically. But to be true anti-racists, we have to recognize systems of white supremacy everywhere and challenge them. That means not only not asking every Black person we see in shul, so did you convert? Or you don't look Jewish. It also means recognizing the whiteness of white Jews and how that shaped our political understanding. As Bentley Addison, a Black Jewish activist in Baltimore, wrote, I feel an underlying anger at white Jews who can't acknowledge the immense white privilege they are awarded in nearly every situation. Denying the privilege you are afforded in this country by claiming to be non-white in the face of someone who hasn't been given that privilege is most certainly not pursuing justice. So it's time that we acknowledge the political costs of those misunderstandings. The fact is that Jews of European descent, white Jews, ran all of the powerful Jewish organizations and most of the religious institutions, and they believed that their perspective, their analysis was normative or true for everyone. They never considered or consulted their own community's members of color, or even recognized the relevance of the fact that they themselves were, in many important ways, white. So to take just one example, and I'll come back to this, of course, many white Jews assumed that our goal of a race-blind America was a universal good, rather than one that in fact blocked the way to a fairer, more genuine racial equality by locking in inequalities that already exist. So what I want to do tonight briefly is review some of that history to identify both the successes and the failures of Jewish civil rights engagement. So to do that, I'm going to violate every rule of the historical profession and use the past in service of the present. I want to plumb the history of Black-Jewish relations for lessons to be learned. The coalition was always rocky, but still incredibly effective. So their successes can teach all of us about effective strategies and possibilities, and their failures can instruct us about potential pitfalls. I'm also going to violate every rule of public speaking and give the conclusions right up front. First, that the Black Jewish Coalition and the broader liberal and progressive coalition won victories in so many areas of civil rights, civil liberties, and economic justice while fighting internally. Blacks and Jews looked up from their differences and by keeping their broader goals in mind, moved forward together. And second, that this coalition was weakened, not just by class and racial differences, which I will talk about, but also by divergent political understandings that those race and class differences led to, most particularly about the liberal goal of race blindness and the invisibility of white privilege to Jews who did not see themselves as entirely white. The fact is that a tie between the Black and Jewish communities, a bond, has long been expressed, and not just among leaders, as some people have argued. Think about Obama Jewish outreach or Jews for Obama. There is no Swedes for Obama or Obama Methodist outreach. Nor was the feeling just among Jews, as other people have claimed. The NAACP routinely protests swastikas and anti-Semitic incidents. Black churches support Israel and rallied in Pittsburgh after the synagogue shooting. And as I recently learned, Martin Luther King's birthday is also National Bagel Day. Who knew? But the bond is not something inherent in our two peoples, something natural or inevitable. There were no Jewish leaders, for example, in the ranks of the abolitionist movement. And in fact, the one Southern rabbi who spoke against slavery was run out of town by his own congregation. And Reform and secular Jews far outnumbered the Orthodox in civil rights work. There wasn't anything special about our both being oppressed minority groups either. So were the Irish and the Japanese. They generally didn't make common cause with other outgroups. In fact, they more often embraced whiteness so as to be integrated into the mainstream more quickly. No, something happened to make African Americans and Jews move toward each other in the way that they did, which is actually a heartening notion that communities, like individuals, have real choices they can make, that there's no such thing as political predestination. We can, as I used to say to my children, make better choices. So let's look back. These two communities had very different histories, but some common experiences around the turn of the 20th century. Many of them migrated to urban areas. 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe and Russia, and 1 million African Americans from south to north in a movement so massive we call it the Great Migration. They had a common experience of discrimination and exclusion from jobs and neighborhoods and schools. And they shared being victims of hatred and violence. While racism was always more virulent in the United States, both were known to erupt into lethal violence. So in response, and like other groups, African Americans and Jewish Americans formed organizations to help themselves. In the Black community, that included the National Association of Colored Women, the NAACP, the National Urban League, the National Council of Negro Women, and their Jewish counterparts, the National Council of Jewish Women. By the way, note that in both communities, women led the way, a fact that was true all the way through the Civil Rights Movement, but that's a story for another time. The American Jewish Committee, Anti-Defamation League, American Jewish Congress, and the Jewish Labor Committee. But while both groups had the same goal of equal opportunity and full inclusion in American life, virtually no organization of white people was willing to work with Black groups to achieve it. Racism made that just too risky an alliance. That's not true of the left, who did, but that again is a story for another time. Oops, sorry. Some individual Jews and Blacks, of course, did work with each other. Of the NAACP's founders, a disproportionate number of whites were Jewish. And Black and Jewish intellectuals in the early 20th century, Horace Cowan, Alan Locke, and Franz Boas, challenged the assimilationist rhetoric around them of 100% Americanism, arguing instead for what they called pluralism, that all groups have different cultures and traditions that we should celebrate, not try to change. These cultural traditions were not a threat, they argued, because underneath we all share the same basic values. We are part of what makes the United States special. But Jews, like other whites, hesitated to get involved with African Americans on a broader level. As an ADL leader reasoned, the difficulties facing the Jews as a minority group are sad enough without tying ourselves up with another minority group of less influence, and by so doing, probably take on some of their troubles, a group whose difficulties, in my estimation, are even more deplorable than our own. But unlike other white groups, these Jews moved toward their Black counterparts. In the 1930s, with the rise of Nazism and fascism here and in Europe, Jews reached out to the Black community for help in holding things like anti-racism rallies. And African Americans took the opportunity to link Nazi racism abroad to racism here at home, which they called the Double V campaign, and pointed out similarities between anti-Jewish violence in Europe and the longstanding anti-Black lynching in the United States. Clearly then, this coming together was based on self-interest on both sides. But that self-interest broadened over the next 2 decades into a wider and active collaboration on a wide range of civil rights issues. And as a good historian, of course, I have to ask why. And really the answer is the same reason that some crimes are successful: time and opportunity. The moment was right. Jews didn't want to call attention to anti-Semitism for fear that it would give it a wider public platform. So instead, they pushed for broad anti-discrimination legislation. And Nazism taught them that whenever anyone was threatened, Jews were always next. For Black leaders, Jews seemed a powerful and well-organized ally, one they could persuasively appeal to, particularly given the Nazi threat. So to make that collaboration work, Black and Jewish leaders emphasized the common plight of Blacks and Jews, shared suffering. We Jews know what restrictions mean. We too have faced handicaps. Because of this, Jews show such deep interest in the Negro's problems, an ADL leader explained. And this is an ADL pamphlet. It's hard to read for you, but the argument is, even though the Klan hates Black people now, it is still a threat to Jews because later they will come after us. The Yiddish press had long covered lynch mobs and called them pogroms, and the deteriorating situation of German Jews received extensive coverage in Black newspapers. So what launched a Black and Jewish collaboration by the 1930s wasn't a broadening of the challenge to discrimination, but instead the decision to work against it together. Still, that was a pivotal shift. It meant that both communities had redefined their self-interest as including the concerns of others, what I call spacious self-interest. But spacious self-interest isn't just understanding that lynching and pogroms both constitute a similar kind of oppression. It's recognizing the links between those issues, framing their agenda as a universalist vision of national and moral concern. This wasn't about Blacks, Jews, but all Americans, and only by attacking one form of bigotry could any group be safe. As King put it about civil rights, if we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. So leaders in both communities emphasized that all civil rights issues were interconnected. So self-interest lay in a broad-based attack on inequalities, and that we were all fighting the same fight. And it worked. In 1938, a Black Baptist church raised funds for Jewish refugees and wrote, "As a race of people whose souls have been made sensitive through many years of persecution and suffering, we extend our profoundest sympathies to the Jewish people in their present plight." And in New York, there were many complaints about white exploitation of Black domestic workers, but only Jews responded, organizing hiring halls with fair contracts for workers. But notice here, who's doing the hiring? When you stress Black and Jewish similarity in suffering, it masks crucial race and class differences between the two communities, which ultimately helped erode the coalition. And a small aside here, in case I haven't provoked enough of you yet, is that all of this occurred over the protests of many Southern Jews, who both had absorbed local racial views and feared, correctly, that speaking up would provoke anti-Semitism. Also another story. So I'm largely speaking here not only of white Jews, but of Northern white Jews, who saw action on civil rights as in Jewish self-interest in that more spacious way. This emerging civil rights coalition was affected also by changing American politics. A new public rhetoric had emerged. The war effort demanded unity. United, we win. And genocidal violence in Europe made the United States emphasize the importance of tolerance and pluralism, at least rhetorically. And then there was the emergent Cold War. Overt US discrimination and segregation was the best propaganda that the Soviet Union had to win over non-white, non-aligned nations. So the result of all these changes and pressures was a newly reshaped political liberalism that understood rights as rooted in individuals, not in groups. It advocated equal access to employment, to housing, to voting, to civic life, protected from discrimination based on your group membership. This liberalism was consciously pluralist and focused on individual action rather than structural change, which sounded too much like communism. Since we're all the same under the skin, all we have to do is change our hearts and all else will follow. And coalition building by Black and Jewish groups both spurred and was shaped by this new liberalism. You can see this in every Black and Jewish venture on behalf of integration in the 40s and 50s. Where segregation existed by law, they challenged it. Where it violated the law, they took discriminators to court. They proposed civil rights planks for Democratic and Republican platforms. They testified before congressional committees on civil rights, civil liberties, and social welfare. They held letter writing campaigns and petitions. They co-sponsored lobbying efforts. They conferred on legislative and legal strategies. And they produced civic education for schools, churches, and civic groups that stressed pluralism and tolerance and emphasized that changing attitudes and behaviors was the key to achieving equality. So discrimination in those terms was was explained not by white people trying to protect their advantage, but by personal bigotry. But again, notice here who is the boss and who is the employee. Their spacious universalist articulation of liberal values meant that these collaborative efforts, went far beyond direct self-interest. Segregation laws obviously did not affect Jews, but all the major Jewish organizations filed briefs for the Brown decision and dozens of earlier and lesser known cases. And the NAACP fought for higher immigration quotas for Jewish refugees and lobbied the Haitian, Liberian, and Filipino UN delegations to support the creation of the State of Israel. And their successes were notable. Black and Jewish agencies and their allies desegregated hospitals, schools, housing projects, unions, bowling leagues, restaurants, beaches, medical and legal associations. Local coalitions passed anti-discrimination and anti-KKK legislation in dozens of cities. They integrated workplaces, challenged the poll tax, and fought segregated housing. In Hollywood, a Black and Jewish group challenged racial and ethnic stereotyping in the movies. And in New York, a joint Black-Jewish effort succeeded in creating the state university system to compensate for racial and religious discrimination at the state's private colleges. They opened social and economic opportunities, expanded anti-discrimination protections, extended educational and legal equality, and expanded the social services safety net. But while all this was happening, there were powerful tensions between the two communities, because while most Blacks and white Jews remained divided by race, religion, and class, this went unrecognized, but had real impacts on people's attitudes. And it was unrecognized because of the limits of liberalism. By focusing on the individual, it missed structural problems which were based on race and class that went beyond personal bias. What I mean is that racial discrimination and its consequences had trapped African Americans, North and South, into low-wage, low-mobility employment, and that was a structural problem. Eastern European Jews had also begun life here at the bottom. But although they were similarly poor, they had come from urban areas and often had skills unavailable to most Black rural agricultural workers. And these two factors, plus good timing and white skin, helped them rise economically despite anti-Semitism. But most Jews who were committed to this individualist liberal ethic didn't recognize the role that structural racism played in limiting Black progress. Oops. So here are Jews who are white and economically more successful, which of course are related, working often in Black areas because they're also less racist. Jews see themselves as open, tolerant, rising on their own hard work. They don't see themselves as whites. Whites persecuted them in Europe. But Black people do see Jews as white. They have economic benefits because they were white, although the Jews didn't see it. So because Jews were in Black neighborhoods, Blacks saw them not as social outsiders, but as insiders exploiting Black outsiders, and they protest. Jews see these protests as anti-Semitic. Black people seeing it as rich white people soaking poor Black people who are excluded from opportunities that whites enjoyed. So to be more explicit, even as they made common cause politically, Black and Jewish collaboration was weakened by racial and class differences that still divided most Blacks and Jews, but that fact went unacknowledged and unaddressed. Despite those tensions, and despite Jews' increasing economic status, Jewish groups continued to support civil rights efforts with Black colleagues well into the 1960s, including demonstrations, marching and lobbying, and the hardest and most dangerous grassroots organizing work. The two heads of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP and Arnold Aronson of the National Jewish Community Relations Council. But the liberal consensus was fraying around them. By the 1960s, to many, especially young people, liberalism seemed to have failed the movement. There had been no federal protection for those engaged in legal activities like registering to vote. Attacks on civil rights workers went unpublished and unpunished. And the Democratic National Convention, at the Democratic National Convention in 1964, that allegedly liberal party refused to seat an integrated Mississippi delegation, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, instead seating the one elected by an illegal all-white primary in order to pacify Southern Democrats. And King was attacked in Chicago, the bastion of Northern liberalism. All this provokes Black nationalism, militants, and Black power. SNCC and CORE become all Black. We see the rise of the Panthers. The idea is you can't trust white liberals because when forced to choose, they act not as liberals, but as whites. Look at the Democratic Convention decision. Liberal whites, including Jews, had prioritized party unity over racial equality. They also criticized liberalism for committing itself to integration, which they argued was both unachievable and was cultural genocide. Many white Jews and most Jewish organizations fundamentally misunderstood the frustration and anger of many Black activists. They saw these moves not only as a tactical error, but as an unfair, even racist rejection of their efforts. Black nationalism and Black separatism were a wound in the heart. So when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee criticized Israeli treatment of Palestinians in 1968, Jews saw it as anti-Semitism, rather than a statement identifying with an anti-colonialist struggle that peoples of color were engaged in around the world. And so they withdrew their support from SNCC. Understanding that other perspective, Jews could have still disagreed on the position, but not taken it as a personal attack. Instead, they demanded that SNCC acquiesce to Jewish concerns before Jews would help them in their struggle for civil rights. So here you can see one example of the effects of invisible white privilege. Without being aware of it, Jewish groups saw themselves more as benefactors than equal partners and made civil rights issues about themselves rather than the larger cause. But meanwhile, Jews are rethinking their own commitments. It wasn't just Israel. As the civil rights movement moved north into the neighborhoods of these liberal Jews, the question of integration took on a very different meaning. With concerns couched in class rather than racial terms, most Jews fled from cities to suburbs almost as quickly as white Christians to avoid what they perceived as the deterioration of their schools and neighborhoods as municipal services declined with the white population. Jewish leaders recommended patience and moderation to Black colleagues. Black leaders, to whom in King's words, later has almost always meant never, read this as evidence that Jews couldn't be relied on as allies. But that wasn't true. Most Jews still believed in the liberal vision, and their blindness to the benefit that white skin brought them allowed them to believe they had risen solely on their own merits. So Black people could do the same if they just kept going. Again, neither group reflected on what we now call intersectionality, that there is no single correct perspective, that everyone interprets the same events from their own equally legitimate standpoint. Understanding this requires intentionally incorporating multiple viewpoints into your political analysis and being wary of potential paternalism. Except around the edges, that really didn't happen. Had they done so, Jews might have also realized more quickly that racism was not just about individual attitudes or even laws, but was also about historical, structural, and institutional racism. Racism that was not incidental to the system, but that actually helped shape those structures and institutions. So let me give a few examples to explain what I mean by structural racism here. Over and over, we have seen policies that use race-neutral language to in fact target Black people. The war against drugs, for example, was created by the Nixon administration, extended under President Reagan and then Donald Trump, was explicitly designed to suppress urban Black activists without admitting it publicly. We know that's true because Nixon advisor and counsel John Ehrlichman admitted it in 1994. By getting the public to associate Blacks with heroin and then criminalizing it heavily, we could disrupt that community. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This is why more Black and brown people have historically been arrested for drug use than white, even though white and Black people use drugs in the same proportion. It's because police are targeting Black neighborhoods rather than white, so that's where they discover the drugs. We white folks assume they're simply focusing on the places where crimes are committed. But then why aren't they on college campuses? And why aren't they in white upper class neighborhoods where drug use is just as prevalent? Most white people, including white Jews, are blind to this sort of racism hidden behind claims that the police are trying to improve public safety, to strengthen law and order. But law and order for whom? The streets may be safer for people who look like me, but they are far less safe for people who are living their lives while Black. In fact, the root of our system of policing is itself rooted in racism, emerging directly from Southern posses that had been organized to capture runaway slaves. And it has prioritized protecting property over Black lives ever since. It's not just criminal justice where we see institutionalized racism. Think of the history of redlining, which I showed before, which penalized African-American homebuyers for decades, locking them into deteriorating neighborhoods. Think about zoning laws in leafy suburbs that mandate a certain amount of land per house, thereby keeping housing prices out of reach for those looking to leave those redlined communities. All of these invisible structures led to the frightening levels of segregation we have today, and its consequences for health, education, and employment opportunities. And because white people don't think of that legacy, we simply lament how few people of color choose to move into our neighborhoods. It's not a matter of individual racism of this real estate agent or that mortgage banker. It is baked into the system. So these diverging political understandings also became visible in occasions of direct Black and Jewish confrontation and division, like in 1968 in Ocean Hill-Brownsville, which pitted a primarily Black community against a primarily Jewish teachers union, and many saw it as a Black-Jewish confrontation. Or the affirmative action cases of the 1970s, DeFunis and Bakke. Black agencies filed briefs on behalf of affirmative action while most Jewish groups filed in opposition. It was the first time that Black and Jewish organizations had positioned themselves on opposite sides of a civil rights case. For Jews, affirmative action violated the race-blind individualist liberalism they still believed in. Explicit consideration of race, that is, group membership, is the antithesis, they said, of liberalism. But for African Americans, affirmative action was crucial to close the gap between the rhetoric of race blindness and the reality of continued discrimination and structural or institutional racism. By not recognizing the opportunity structures of white supremacy that we ourselves benefited from, we couldn't challenge them, and so failed our civil rights colleagues and our fellow citizens, not to mention our fellow Jews of color. Other examples of Black-Jewish conflict became nastier, such as the violence in Crown Heights and Black anti-Semitism, including, of course, Minister Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam. But it wasn't just political differences or violence that lessened cooperation. The Jewish community had changed. It was now economically solidly in the middle class. And now living primarily in white suburbs, Jews and their agencies turned their attention away from problems of racism, poverty, and urban life. Some went further. Neoconservatives argued that liberalism had been transformed into favoritism, social disorganization, bloated budgets, and a nanny state. So if Black nationalists challenged liberalism from one side, a Jewish shift toward conservatism and parochialism did so on the other. And the outgrowth of this sort of distrust of others also led to what we now call identity politics, which refocused or narrowed what each group defined as its self-interest and its particular concerns. Meanwhile, the gap between Black and white incomes and life chances, which had begun to shrink in the 1960s, widened again. White backlash, which swept Richard Nixon, then Ronald Reagan, then Donald Trump into office, in each case reversed progress toward educational and residential desegregation and weakened civil rights laws and remedies. And in each case, public discourse returned to the familiar and chillingly racist rhetoric of us versus them, which cast African Americans outside the boundaries of American society, joined after 9/11, of course, by Muslims. And more recently, as we've seen, it now includes immigrants, feminists, queer folks, and Jews. But back to our story. By the 1980s or so, Blacks and Jews then faced very different problems. And liberalism, especially the fractured liberalism that emerged out of the chaos of the 1960s and 70s, seemed either unable to solve them or discredited altogether. And that's where the story usually ends. But I argue that liberalism didn't die, and that most Blacks and Jews were, and still are, motivated by liberal values. The fact is that all along, most Jews have looked a lot like traditional liberals, in their lesser level of racism, their continued commitment to traditional civil rights, their attitude towards social issues, and certainly in their self-perception. But Black and Jewish groups no longer understood themselves as sharing priorities, and both had largely discredited the rhetoric of universalism in favor of self-assertion. So it's not surprising that the partnership had withered. But even during those years, liberal political cooperation didn't cease, it just became less visible. As you know, Black and Jewish groups continued and continue now to collaborate on aid to public education, anti-poverty programs, access to healthcare, hate crimes and anti-discrimination legislation, voting rights, women's rights, gender equality. They continue to challenge outbursts of genocidal violence and racial and religious hatred. And they still monitor all cases of bigotry and continue their tolerance work, which is now called diversity and inclusion. And in more recent affirmative action cases, most Jewish groups filed briefs in favor, because now more Jews understood the conflicts between race-blind theory and existing structures of inequality. In fact, Blacks and Jews are still the two groups most likely to vote Democratic. 81% of African Americans and 74% of Jews voted Democrat in 2016, 87% and 76% in 2020. That is still the highest two groups, even higher than gays and lesbians. And both groups have reasserted the importance of working together, even in Crown Heights. For some time now, well before Trump had emerged, there's been a striking new energy in both communities to tackle social problems, from voting rights to LGBTQ equality, from ongoing discrimination to strengthening civic engagement, and to doing so in coalition. It's visible in national forums and in local church and synagogue links and action groups across the country. But that work has become broader than exclusively Black-Jewish dialogue or even Black-Jewish political collaboration. Today, the most active coalitions include the intentionally broad and intersectional Movement for Black Lives, Showing Up for Racial Justice, Move On, Moral Mondays Coalition, and Women's March and Indivisible. Some Jewish groups have engaged with them, but others view them with fear or skepticism. And that concern, I think, reflects the same problems as we saw in the earlier civil rights coalitions. By making our engagement contingent on, say, Black Lives Matter's views on Palestinians, for example, is to claim that it is our agenda that has to be satisfied before we can join in the struggles of others. And in this new civil rights landscape, white people's failures to see structural racism and to challenge their own white privilege is an explicit issue. So the insistence of many Jews that they are not white, in the eyes of white supremacists at least, and in their self-perception, keeps them from investigating how they themselves support systems of racism. We face serious issues today, and they are urgent. You all know the importance of the many challenges we face as Jews, as a nation, and as a globe. So how do we move forward? We use the lessons of the civil rights movement, both the good and the bad. This time, white Jews must not ignore structural realities, institutional barriers to equal opportunity, or deny our own whiteness and its consequences. When Jews focus too much on our victimhood and not on our privilege, we fail to realize that much of our success came from opportunities and benefits accorded only to whites. And so we lost our ability to strategize effectively to bring down those barriers, and we lost the trust of our coalition partners. Changing hearts and minds is not enough. A race-blind vision of equality is not enough. We have to acknowledge that Jews of European descent are white as far as structures of opportunity are concerned. We have to confront our role in supporting white supremacist institutions and fight to dismantle them even when they help us. Our non-action is complicity. To do that in the context of civil rights work, we have to rethink our role in the struggle by listening to other perspectives and re-examining our assumptions. It means we have to come to the table as committed partners to the civil rights agenda, as one group among equals, rather than demanding a quid pro quo or dictating methods or strategies as if we are the power brokers. It means we have to focus on points of commonality among allies, shared agendas, and recognize that there are points of difference without letting them stop forward motion. Of course, there are fierce disagreements within both the Black and Jewish communities about how to proceed. Hell, I have disagreements with myself, two Jews, three opinions. we have to confront the differences, and then we have to find ways to move on despite them. In short, we have to return to defining our self-interest spaciously, that your problem is my problem and that we're in it together, especially in an era where all too often compassion for others, the very idea of a civil society, has vanished as a motivation for action or legislation. And we have to do it because it is more clear than ever that our agenda is the civil rights agenda. Anti-Semitism is real and growing, or at least growing more open and more violent. As we saw on January 6th, this surge of anti-Semitism is not an aberration, but a part of a larger system that upholds white supremacy. As organizer Kendra Watkins wrote, white Jews must understand that anti-Semitism is not an exceptional form of oppression, but part of a larger framework that uses various forms of oppression to reinforce one another. In other words, we must understand Jews of European descent as both white and non-white. So I'll end with the words of Aboriginal activist and artist Lilla Watson. If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Thank you.
Wow, Cheryl, thank you so much. That was quite a tour of the history as well as the present. I'd love to give you all the chance to ask some questions. As I said, the chat is open. It will come to me. So if you're able to type any questions into the chat, I will convey them to Cheryl and we can have a little discussion.
And if you're frustrated because I talk too fast, blame Elizabeth because she made me keep it to time.
Trying to keep our Zoom programs to a manageable length, but that was very impressive. And if you're overwhelmed by everything we just heard, that's understandable also, but we'll take a few minutes for some questions to come up. So we have a couple of questions here. Appreciation for the very comprehensive and enlightening, and especially the many visuals. It's very, very helpful. We had a question about Black interest in Islam. Is there anything that you can help explain about that, historically or otherwise? I'm
assuming the question is in Islam, generally not in the Nation of Islam, although I'll speak briefly at least to both of them, just in case. Yeah. The Nation of Islam was explicitly a Black nationalist organization that was begun in the early 20th century. And it has recruited people to its particular brand of Islam ever since. It is, again, explicitly a racial group, organization, and argues that Black Muslims are the authentic group and that they have to be concerned with that. So they don't concern themselves, for example, with white Muslims. There's also been an increasing interest in the Black community of regular, normal Islam, in part because the son of Elijah Muhammad, who ran the Nation of Islam for so many years, rejected it and went to normal, traditional Islam himself and took many followers with him. And also because it seems to be a rebellion against the sort of Western oppression that Black people are objecting to. But I think I want to point to one other thing that people never think about, I think, which is they are the only groups organizing in prisons and in Black communities. They're going through prisons and trying to educate people and talk to them about their problems and bring them some kind of intellectual challenge and change. And so people are joining them because they are the only voices there. So I think that's also a huge reason for the growth of interest in Islam.
Great, thank you, Cheryl. While we're waiting to see what other questions people might have, I guess I'll just ask one of my own. Like, what do you see as what's been most striking to you, sort of in the past year, as an expert in this area of the history of relationships, this political partnership or alliance?
I'll say two completely contradictory things. The first is that I wrote this book a while ago, and periodically I'm asked to speak on it, but all of a sudden, after Black Lives Matter, it exploded. I was invited to speak to every synagogue and historical society and organization. The Jewish archives invited me to speak, the American Jewish Archives. What they have to do with either Blacks and Jews or the present is not clear to me. But either way, every Jewish organization I could think of was interested in this question about the Black-Jewish alliance and questions of how to regain the momentum in civil rights. That really impressed me. I did not see the same engagement elsewhere in the rest of the white community. There was some, but this was a serious reaching out. And that was really positive. The other thing that I've seen, though, is a surprising pushback on against this move, saying Jews really aren't white, this is not our problem, and anyway, Black people are anti-Semitic, and anyway, look at their position on this, or this Black person said this, and so I'm not going to get involved. And not recognizing that, again, it's not about Israel, it's about civil rights. It's not about a Black person, it's about this larger issue. So both of those views, both the embrace and the rejection, have surprised me.
Great, thank you. So a couple other questions, actually several coming in. Let me see if I can manage. One says the resurgence of the KKK was somewhat powered by white grievance culminating in the lynching of Leo Frank. Was there any kind of alliance between Jews and Blacks at that time in the South? So that time would be in the 1920s.
19 teens.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a very interesting question for a couple of reasons. Leo Frank is a Jewish man from the North who is who opens a business in the South. A young white woman is found killed in the basement of his factory, and the two suspects are Frank himself and an African-American janitor. And surprisingly, Southern whites turn not to blame Black people for this, but to blame Jews. And so Leo Frank is tried and found guilty of murder. And even though it's fairly clear that he was innocent, and when sentenced to death, the governor, recognizing that this was really not a very good thing, commuted it to life in prison, at which point a bunch of white people came in and pulled him out of prison and killed him, lynched him. And that was the first lynching we know about of explicitly Jewish people, as opposed to Black people who, of course, hundreds have been lynched. And so it did absolutely raise questions in many Jewish people's minds about, oh my God, we're in this together. And one of the results of that was the founding of the Anti-Defamation League, which explicitly said, we are against discrimination against everybody, and they point to this example. But it also meant that the ADL and the other groups that already existed refused to get involved with Black groups because they didn't want to call attention to the fact that people were linking Black and Jewish violence. And so let's keep it off of our doorstep. Let's not invite any more violence to us by talking about it. So it's got a very ironic sort of double edge there.
Okay, fascinating. What do you see as the single biggest error the Jewish community is making today in its relations with the Black community?
I'm not talking, by the way, about errors the Black community is making. Okay, I just want to be clear. I'm being one-sided because this is the Jewish Historical Society. But I would say the response that frustrates me most, I think there are lots of real issues, but the response I would say that troubles me the most is what I mentioned before about this person is anti-Semitic or that person criticized Israel and therefore I won't support them. And the reason that it troubles me is not just that it's a side issue, but what does it mean? If you don't take the right position on Israel, I won't fight for civil rights. I won't fight against racism, that is absolutely not what people mean, right? No one is going to say, I'm going to become a racist if you don't change your view. So what that says to me is, I am still important enough to this effort that my withholding my commitment is going to push you in my direction. And so I really see that as a misunderstanding, I'll just say, of white Jews about what their role is. And again, I think that's all from white supremacy. We always think we're right. We're white.
We have a question here about how do you explain the difference between Orthodox and non-Orthodox awareness of these issues? Concern about politically right-leaning that seems to ignore the anti-Semitism on the right and be extremely worried about Black anti-Semitism.
Well, both sides are worried about Black anti-Semitism, but absolutely. I had a moment of hope when, during the Black Lives Matter protests, there was a very small protest in, I think it was Crown Heights, of Orthodox men standing and holding their signs, and that was really great. But then I lost that enthusiasm and optimism when I saw the Orthodox and Hasidic participation in January 6th takeover of the Capitol. My sense is, I mean, again, this is not my own view. I mean, I didn't come up with this, my own idea, but Orthodox Jews are interested in separation. They're interested in tradition. They're interested in protection, and they are not interested in secular issues. So, and so law and order is good for, they like that. Protection of the family is good. They like that. Getting the government out of their hair, they like that. They're not as concerned about racism. There are not a lot of Hasidic Black Jews. And so I think it is not surprising that they are politically conservative. Just like there's a group of African Americans, of course, who are politically conservative. I always thought that African American community would be the strongest Republican force if only the Republicans were less racist, right? Because otherwise, most values held by in the Black community are in fact held by Republicans.
Fascinating, and that's a good to remind ourselves that, of course, in the Orthodox world, there's lots of different people with lots of different politics, but we're talking about the more rightward leaning
Yes.
parts of the Orthodox world there. Yeah. A question, again, only speak to it if you feel comfortable, but aside from not asking Jews of color if they've recently converted, do you have any other thoughts about how white Jews in the greater Hartford community can be more welcoming or respectful of?
It's a great question. And I think there's a complicated answer. Before all this stuff happened, I was contacted by two different synagogues, one in New York, B'nai Jeshurun, and one in Washington, D.C., Addis, Israel. Both had decided separately that they were going to embark on a year-long self-study about Black Jews, essentially, about Jews of color, and how to better welcome them and how to create a community that didn't ignore them and brought them in. And those discussions ranged from everything from they had security in their synagogues because it was in DC, because it was dangerous, right? There had been attacks on synagogues, but those guards were stopping Black people from coming in and saying, well, what are you doing here? Right. So they had to think through everything from protection all the way to how do we make sure that the Black people who are here, or the people of color who are here, are fully integrated into our committees, into our leadership. How do we bring people out who have not been focused on before and help them reshape things? How do we introduce Sephardic tunes into our music, right? There are lots of different ways to do it, but they all have to be thought through, and it's very, very challenging.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's been a lot in the past year, especially a lot of more raising up of listening to Jews of color and what they're sharing about their experiences, which I think is really helpful for all of us.
Yes. And they're speaking out more too, which is also good.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. Again, I don't know if you can answer this, but maybe a segue for me. So question, what are your insights about Black Jewish connections in Hartford historically and now? You've at least been a resident, a part of the community here for a number of years, so.
I think that the Jewish community, as far as I can tell, so that's sort of limited to certain areas, obviously, in the Hartford area, are absolutely good liberal people. They don't like discrimination. They speak out against racism. They talk about this rabbi who went down south and remember that and all that sort of stuff. But I don't see them at soup kitchens, and I don't see them showing up for Black Lives Matter protests. Some may, but it's much more limited. So the Jewish Community Relations Council has had me to speak several times, but I'm not sure of any particular outreach they have done with Black organizations. It doesn't mean they don't, but right. A few years ago, the Anti-Defamation League in the state Anti-Defamation League debated whether or not they would support affirmative action. And I was on the board at that point, and I said, if you don't support affirmative action, I'm quitting the organization because you clearly don't get it. And they did, to their credit, decide to support affirmative action. But the fact that we had to have that conversation was kind of shocking to me. So I think we are good liberals, we Jews, in Hartford, but I keep waiting for the other piece. There are lots of good Jewish progressives too, but they're not in Jewish organizations, as far as I can see. There are a couple, but it's harder. So I'm hopeful.
Interesting. Thank you so much. And just since we're talking about Hartford history, this is my opportunity to say that we're very interested in documenting different aspects of this relationship in the Hartford area over time. Since I advertised this talk, I've gotten some interesting conversations with people and some tidbits of history. So we're looking forward to being able to offer more documentation and exploration of what this has looked like in this area. I guess we're just about at time, so I'm just want to mention that the Hartford Jewish Film Festival is screening a documentary called Shared Legacies next month, which is on this topic of the history of the Black Jewish Alliance, and also hosting a talk by Susanna Heschel on March 18th, who's going to be talking about Blacks, Jews, and Black Jews. So there are more opportunities to learn more about this. And I just really like to thank Cheryl for sharing her knowledge and her presentation with us tonight, and thank all of you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm stopping the recording.